Rocket with ASEAN 2017's Media Affairs and Strategic Communications team, and I will be your moderator. Thank you for being with us again today. I am pleased to have the Acting Department of Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Mr. Robespierre Bolivar, for today's press briefing. Mr. Bolivar will give us the most recent update on the ASEAN ministerial meetings and related meetings as of today, August 6. Without further ado, I am pleased to welcome Mr. Robespierre Bolivar.
Magandang hapon po. Good afternoon again. I would like to read a statement, especially on the outcomes of the post-ministerial conferences thus far. As you may know, the schedule that we have would take the post-ministerial conferences up to around 8 o'clock in the evening. But as is tradition in ASEAN meetings, some of them go overtime. And I believe that it would go beyond 8 o'clock. So I can only brief you on what has transpired so far. And then we'll take a couple of questions afterwards. At yesterday's briefing, we mentioned that the meeting of the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Commission on August 4 took place. The Department of Foreign Affairs issued a press release on this, which is now live on our website. But allow me to highlight that during the meeting of the Commission, the ministers reached the decision to extend the implementation of the Plan of Action to implement the Schonfest Treaty through 2022. The 5-year Plan of Action of the Schonfest Treaty is expiring this year after it was adopted in 2013. In his intervention at the Schonfest Commission meeting, Secretary Cayetano underscored the Philippines' support for the full implementation of the treaty, consistent with the region's goal of preserving the region as a nuclear weapons-free zone and ensuring the safety of the peoples of ASEAN. Today, the marathon meetings with the dialogue partners in the post-ministerial conferences is taking place. This morning, the ASEAN foreign ministers met with the foreign ministers of Canada, the Republic of Korea, New Zealand, and Australia. In the early afternoon, they met with the Foreign Minister of the People's Republic of China. In the ASEAN-Canada ministerial meeting, the ministers welcomed the announcement by Canada that it is sponsoring a new $10 million Canadian scholarship program for post-secondary students and mid-career professionals from Southeast Asia. The scholarships and educational exchanges for development, or SEED, will benefit individuals from ASEAN member states wishing to access Canadian education. The meeting also reviewed the progress of the ASEAN-Canada dialogue and provided the ministers the opportunity to discuss the future direction of the partnership. The Philippines also announced the invitation issued by President Rodrigo Roa Duterte for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to attend the East Asia Summit in November as a guest of the chair. In the ASEAN Republic of Korea ministerial meeting, the ministers highlighted the integration of micro, small, and medium enterprises into the digital economy. They expressed appreciation for the role of the ASEAN Korea Center in promoting cooperation. The ministers welcomed the establishment of the ASEAN Cultural House in Busan, noting that this demonstrates the deepening of people-to-people ties and the exceptional level of cooperation between ASEAN and the Republic of Korea. In the ASEAN-New Zealand ministerial meeting, the ministers reviewed the progress of ASEAN-New Zealand cooperation and assessed its future direction. They highlighted the major achievements of the action plan for 2016-2017, including a maritime security and counterterrorism exercise under the ADMM Plus cooperation framework, and an ASEAN Young Diplomat Study Tour and annual scholarships for 225 ASEAN students. The foreign ministers also expressed their appreciation for New Zealand's support for the operationalization of the AHA Center in Jakarta. At the ASEAN-Australia Ministerial Meeting, the ministers took note of the comprehensive relations with Australia across all three pillars of the ASEAN community. They discussed preparations for the ASEAN-Australia Special Summit next year. They welcomed Australia's continued commitment to support ASEAN centrality and ASEAN-led mechanisms, and Australia's contribution to ASEAN community building. The ministers expressed appreciation for Australia's continued support through the ASEAN Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Area Economic Cooperation Support Program. In the ASEAN-China Ministerial Meeting, the ministers noted the progress since the last ASEAN-China PMC in Vientiane in 2016, including the successful commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the ASEAN-China dialogue relations. They welcomed the entry into force of the protocol to upgrade the ASEAN-China Free Trade Area and agreed to step up negotiations to achieve the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. The ministers agreed to designate 2017 as the ASEAN-China Year of Tourism Cooperation, which seeks to complement the Visit ASEAN at 50 campaign. The foreign ministers of ASEAN and China also adopted the framework of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. The ministers also agreed on 3 steps following the adoption of the framework. First, the announcement of the adoption of the framework at the 50th AMM and related meetings, where we expect a paragraph in the chairman's statement of the PMC reflecting this fact. Second, a meeting will be convened at the end of August to discuss the modalities for the negotiations of the actual Code of Conduct, with the approved framework as the basis for the talks. And third, the leaders of ASEAN and China are expected to announce the formal start of negotiations on the Code at their summit in November. Parallel to this, ASEAN and China will continue to cooperate on such practical maritime cooperation efforts, including management and prevention of conflicts among parties through confidence-building measures, as well as to prevent miscalculations on the ground. Thank you, and we're ready for a few questions.
Okay, as before, please come up to the mics and say your name and affiliation, and kindly limit your questions for follow-ups to give opportunity for others to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Reporter from Xinhua News Agency. My question is, as you just mentioned, China proposed a 3-step version for step up for the consultation on the COC. So what's your comment for the China's proposed the 3-step version? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. The foreign ministers of ASEAN and China have in fact agreed on this 3-step process. So there is a consensus between ASEAN and China on this.
Good afternoon, sir. Ayi Makaraig from AFP. Sir, could you explain the reason behind the delay in the release of the joint communique of the ASEAN foreign ministers? And what would be your comment on Vietnam pushing for the mention of a legally binding code of conduct in the South China Sea in that communique, and Cambodian efforts to remove mention of this phrase? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. The joint communique will be released as a package with all of the chairman's statements of the ARF, the EAS, APT, and PMC meetings at the end of this cycle of meetings. I guess that would be Monday or Tuesday in 2 days' time. As to your second question, as I mentioned before, the joint communique is a consensus document, and whatever comes out of the joint communique would mean that all 10 ASEAN member states would have agreed to that kind of language.
So is it correct to assume that because the release was delayed, as of now there is no consensus on issues like the South China Sea?
This is more, I was informed that this was more a standard practice to release it all at the same time. There were even incidents in the past, AMMs, that the joint communique was in fact released days after all the meetings were ended and people have already left whatever capital that was. So we just want to release it as a package, as one whole package with all the other chairman statements.
So just
Thank you,
the
ma'am.
change from yesterday, because you said it would be released shortly.
Yes, I clarified that after the questions I received. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, good afternoon. Ron Sir, Kyodo News. Now that the framework of the COC has been adopted and we expect formal announcement of the negotiations by the leaders in November, are we expecting China, or are we getting commitment from China that there will be no further fortification of those reclaimed and features in the South China Sea, meaning status quo, no further developments there?
I cannot go into the details of what was discussed at the ASEAN China PMC, but whatever was discussed would be reflected in the chairman's statement of that PMC. And this is the adoption of the framework at this AMM is a symbol of the commitment between ASEAN and China to really push for the conclusion of an effective, substantive code of conduct.
So, yeah, I'm just wondering, because if would ASEAN raise a, I mean, would the negotiations be affected if ASEAN finds out that there are some actions taken in those disputed reefs?
Well, definitely we would expect ASEAN member states, if there is significant development, either positive or negative, to raise it during the appropriate meetings.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Melo Acuña from China Radio International. Would you be able to tell us if Secretary Cayetano made extra efforts to bridge the interests of Vietnam and China to come up with a solid statement?
Thank you, Melo. Of course, as chair, that is one of his roles, is to seek the consensus of the group.
Precisely.
And that is why the joint communique, when it comes out in a day or two, would actually be a consensus document agreed upon by all 10 ASEAN member states.
I see. Thank you.
Good evening, sir. This is Akiko Suzuki from the Asahi Shimbun. I heard there won't be no publication or issuing of any documents on COC framework this time. If I'm right, what is the reason? I mean, that means basically we cannot see what it's all about. Could you tell me the reason why?
Yes, just to confirm that the framework of the Code of Conduct is not a public document, primarily because it is the basis for the negotiations of the actual code. And the discussions would be structured around the elements of the framework, enumerated in the framework of the Code of Conduct. And as you can imagine, the talks would be very sensitive in nature. So we don't want to preempt, we don't want to prejudge anything that would eventually come out in the code.
Okay, we're taking last two questions.
Hi, Jake with the Wall Street Journal. I just wanted to seek a clarification on the ASEAN-China meeting. Did the issue of North Korea come up at any point? And if so, what was the nature of that discussion, please?
Well, the ASEAN-China Foreign Ministers Meeting, of course, member states are free to raise issues. I believe they did have a discussion on regional international issues of common concern. I cannot really speak to the details of what they actually discussed, but if member states feel strongly, of course, about the DPRK, and in fact, Foreign Minister Wang Yi was asked about that in his press conference, then if any member state would wish to raise it, then I'm sure it will be discussed.
Last question. Okay, if we have no further questions, this ends today's briefing. Thank you.